Hello, fam. This is Dr. Ade, coming to you in the spirit of Imhotep as usual, reminding you that you should first know yourself. After that, knowledge of God and the universe will be made available to you. I'm reminding people that this is an Afrocentric channel designed to present information, knowledge, and issues from an African perspective. I do use the term African very broadly to apply to all people of African descent. If you find objection with this, then please go to a different channel that makes you feel good. There is no problem with that. Let's get into the tutorial to Unwash African Brains, Part 2. This is Part 2. And I've been working hard on this particular edition, trying to keep it short. I tried my best to cut out a lot of discussion and just focus on the diagrams, the illustrations, and the charts. But when I did so, the real message did not come through. So you will have to forgive me on the timing, but there was information I just could not cut out. Now, I've broken this information down to a level where a high school student can understand it. This tutorial provides Africans everywhere with the knowledge, the language, and the method to intellectually and systematically analyze and assess your individual, cultural, and spiritual condition. This tutorial is presented at a critical time because Africans in America are at a tipping point of violent attacks at the hands of Caucasian Americans. This is the very time when our own African mother culture, philosophy, traditions, and religion should be used as tools for survival. Regrettably, we have Africans, even on the continent, who are rejecting them. We are witnessing a wicked society that is hell-bent on killing us all. And yet, after centuries of Caucasian brutality, masses of brainwashed African Americans vainly continue to believe that Caucasians can be humanized and redeemed by our love. There is hope. African youths on the continent are just waking up at this time, waking up out of a brainwashing stupor to recognize Caucasians for who and what they are. It is the youths of Africa who are wisely and forcefully proposing that no political leader can be sworn into office unless she or he swears on the African shrine not to participate in corruption. These youths on the continent know from experience that when God's higher forces are keeping an eye on you, no human being needs to watch you. Now, part 2 sums up the full and factual nature of Caucasians in 5 words, and those 5 words are easily memorized. Some will say that these words are hateful, or hurtful, or divisive, or even unchristian. However, no one will be able to refute the accuracy and the truthfulness and the righteousness of what is presented in this tutorial. Centuries of recorded Caucasian behavior are there in plain sight for even the physically blind to see. Sadly, however, there are Africans who are so thoroughly assimilated into the Caucasian matrix, either voluntarily or involuntarily, that they are in a mental and spiritual stupor. This wake-up tutorial, it's important, because you will never get this information in the school system. You will never get this information from most of your Black church leaders. Every homeschooler and every Sunday schooler needs to be tuned in to this channel, because this channel removes all excuses about not knowing how to unwash your brain. However, it is up to you. Come whosoever will. Those with ears will hear and change themselves. And once I present the information, I have done what God has sent me to do. I remind you of the introduction and the problem that are being discussed in this tutorial. The problem, as I see it, is that African assimilation into Caucasian culture has created serious harm to the African psyche. And it just about has us insane, because it has removed us from reality. Part 1 of this tutorial provides the cultural information needed to grasp the deep cultural implications that are contained in this Part 2. So Part 2 reveals how the attitudes, beliefs, values, worldview, and, watch out, the 5 dominant features of Caucasian culture are hostile to the African psyche, spirituality, well-being, and survival. At the end of Part 2, I'm going to present an illustration that introduces Part 3. I didn't plan on Part 3, but Part 3 is necessary. So Part 3 demonstrates how a change in beliefs and values is motivating the current social uprisings. It provides understanding as to how a change in beliefs and values is actually motivating the current social uprisings. This is the approach that I'm using. In part 2, I present a cross-cultural analysis of traditional African and traditional Caucasian cultures. I reveal the psychological dangers and harms of African assimilation into Caucasian culture. I suggest strongly that Africans should strengthen their ancestral self-identity as a strategy for survival. And I encourage open community dialogue on the critical issue of African assimilation of Caucasian culture and cultural features. Let's get into the cross-cultural analysis. We will be analyzing traditional African culture and traditional Caucasian culture. Let's do a brief review of part 1. This diagram was the last frame shown at the end of part 1, and it represents the 3 elements of culture within the human psyche that were discussed in part 1. So as discussed in part 1, attitudes are the most numerous of the 3, and they are easily changed through experience, travel, study, etc., etc. Attitudes are the most numerous. However, attitudes reside at a shallow level of the human psyche. Let's go on to beliefs. Beliefs are fewer, but they're stronger, and they are harder to change because beliefs are held as what is real and true. Now we have to remember, or we should remember, that beliefs are not facts. Values are even fewer, but they are the most powerful because values represent what is right or wrong, what's good or bad, what is better or worst. Values allow us to make judgments throughout life, and they can be understood as the puppet masters of human behavior. This is why they are very hard to change. These values that represent the highest ideals in a society. Now, just as the illustration shows, attitudes are at a shallow level of the psyche. Beliefs are at a deeper level of the psyche, and values are at the very deepest level of the human psyche. A change in values is the best way to create long-lasting change in human behavior. However, its permanency, the permanency of that change is not always guaranteed. Let's go on to compare and contrast features of the two worldviews. On the left, you see the African. On the right, you see the Caucasian. In the African worldview, you have a spiritual reality. On the Caucasian side, a material reality. The African worldview is holistic. The Caucasian is compartmental. The African worldview is cooperative, and the Caucasian is competitive. On the African side, it is communalistic or communal. On the Caucasian side, it is individualistic. The African worldview has a past, present, future time orientation. The Caucasian has a future time orientation. Now, what is worldview? Worldview is the way in which people see or envision the world. It also addresses how human beings believe the world is structured and how it operates. The African worldview is spiritual, which simply means that African people believe in the reality of divine spirit as the foundation of the universe. Now, every traditional culture in the world holds this spiritual worldview except Caucasian culture, which holds a material worldview. What does that mean? It means that if you hold a material worldview, that worldview does not view or see divine spirit as being a reality. The spiritual worldview creates the holistic feature in traditional African culture. Traditional African culture is cooperative, which means it is a helping or supportive strategy for social stability. It is also communal or communalistic, and this is a feature that values the importance of the group over the importance of the individual. The traditional time orientation for African culture is a past, present, future orientation. This means that all three overlap each other and sometimes are intertwined with each other. Neither is independent from the other two. Now, we've already talked about the Caucasian culture being or having a material worldview, which means it doesn't view divine spirit as a reality. Only if something can be touched, seen, heard, smelled, or tasted can it be deemed as real in the physical reality. So it defines the world. This Caucasian worldview defines the world as being compartmental. Everything is in separate categories. Even God is assigned to a designated place. Competition is at the base of Caucasian social interaction and relationships. And individualism is a key factor where the individual is valued over the group. A future time orientation is a key component to Caucasian culture and worldview. This is an illustration of the African spiritual worldview. In the illustration, you see that God's spirit is at the center of the universe. It acts as a kind of glue to hold everything in creation together. And at the same time, the essence and energy of God's divine spirit is said to send out energy waves that permeate everything in creation, everything involving nature, everything involving the physical world, everything involving human beings and human society. All these things are permeated by God's divine spirit. That's the way it is seen. Human beings, for example, are spirits. Spirits that are encapsulated with a physical outer body. And human beings were created that way because we live in a three-dimensional world in which we must learn lessons so that we can spiritually evolve. This is the reason behind it. So I'm expressing African belief with this emphasis on a spiritual world reality. Spirit is considered the highest reality, and God's essence is considered present in all creation. Now, this diagram represents the Caucasian material worldview. You see, it is compartmental. The exclusive emphasis is on a material reality. If you take note at the bottom right-hand corner of the diagram, you see that spirit is outside the Caucasian consideration of reality. God's essence is not seen to present or to be present in all creation. Even thought, feeling, mind, and human will. In Caucasian culture, those things are explained in terms of physical laws, not spiritual ones. So you can see that the two cultures, the two mindsets, the two worldviews are very different. We go on to compare and contrast socio-political features of African culture and Caucasian culture. In African culture, the features, socio-political features, are brotherhood, a traditional extension of redeeming goodwill. And that redeeming goodwill is offered to everyone. We have gender equality, a tradition of complementary opposites. Democracy, that is a tradition in Africa of governance by all citizens. Tolerance, the tradition of human rights and civil liberties. And peacefulness, a tradition of avoiding war and strife and violence and disorder and commotion. In Caucasian culture, instead of brotherhood, you have racism, a tradition of Caucasian supremacy. Instead of gender equality, you have sexism, a tradition of male superiority. These are the features of them socially and politically. Instead of democracy, you find imperialism, a tradition of world rulership. Instead of tolerance, there is hegemony. Some people say hegemony. I say hegemony, which is the traditional imposition of culture and religion on those who don't want it. And finally, on the African side, you have peacefulness. On the Caucasian side, there is violence. The habitual, compulsive, intentional use of physical force upon non-Caucasians. Now, because this particular frame is so important, I'm going over these 5 features again. The 5 features of Caucasian culture they are racism, sexism, imperialism, hegemony, and violence. So, when we begin to discuss assimilation of African people into Caucasian culture, this is what you are assimilating into. You are assimilating into a belief and a claim that Caucasians are genetically superior and supreme. You are assimilating into a belief, a tradition of male superiority. You are assimilating into a false notion of imperialism, that Caucasians should rule the world. You are assimilating into a tradition and practice of hegemony. So you think it's all right that someone, an alien culture, should impose its culture and religion upon you. So you assimilate into it. And violence. Violence is the norm. Not just violence. We're talking about habitual, compulsive, intentional use of physical force against non-Caucasians of which you are one. Let's now go into the psychological aspects of the two cultures. Now, anything psychological deals with the mind or the mental state of a person. This includes the human will that influences human behavior. So again, we see opposites in the psychological aspects of each culture. On the traditional African side, being is very important. It relates to one's spiritual development, which cannot be falsified. Xenophilia is defined as an affection for an extension of goodwill towards strangers. There is a focus on human similarities. The traditional African way of thinking and speaking is circular and indirect. When it comes to group decision making and it's time for change, it's done by consensus. So when the majority decides, the rest accept and support that decision. Caucasian culture places emphasis on doing. When it comes to strangers, xenophobia, which is a fear or dislike of strangers, is traditionally the Caucasian response. There is a divisive focus on human differences. No one seems to understand why Caucasians hate the rest of humanity for no reason. You don't have to do anything to them. As long as you have pigmentation in your skin, you are different from them, and therefore they hate you. This pattern of Caucasian thinking is linear and direct. And the Caucasian approach to change is traditionally one of conflict. Let's go on to compare and contrast cultural values. Now, we've already discussed the fact that values deal with the highest ideals in society. Highly moral ideals about what is good, what is just, what is right, and what is fair. Ideal cultural values are the values and norms that a society professes to believe. They give lip service to it. However, real cultural values are the values and norms that a society actually practices. Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do. So there can be conflicting cultural values. Contradictions can exist between people's professed values and their actual behavior or actions. For example, some of the strongest Caucasian American cultural ideals are material success, democracy, patriotism, science, technology, equality, justice, and individualism. Some of the values that I just listed are true to form when you look at the culture. However, the values of democracy and equality, for example, certainly conflict with the ongoing practice of white supremacy, white privilege, and racial discrimination, as well as the gross brutality and violence aimed at people of color, especially Africans. But these are the things that African people have and continue to assimilate into out of their admiration for Caucasian people. All right, we switch up a little by taking the next step, discussing cultural assimilation, brainwashing into the Caucasian cultural matrix. The first thing that becomes lost when African people assimilate into Caucasian culture is the loss of ancestral culture, the loss of African ancestral culture. So you become cut off from who you really are. You become cut off from those who gave you life. So cultural assimilation, first of all, is the process in which a minority group, in this case Africans, a minority group replaces its ancestral culture and history and chooses the culture of a dominant alien group. It is the act of accepting the attitudes, beliefs, values, behaviors, and norms of an alien group that is against you. This is a dangerous development that undermines survival, especially in this case when the dominant alien group is racist, hostile, and violent toward you. Now, I'm not advocating violence, but when someone is guilty of centuries of violence, centuries of murder around the world, centuries, then the laws of karma, the laws of God, the laws of the universe are against them. You will, they will reap what they have sown. Let's move on to how this cultural assimilation is an anti-survival development. Now, I can easily demonstrate that because culture itself, one's mother culture, is a survival strategy. When you reject it, when you give it up, by insanely assimilating into a culture that hates you and does violence to you. The question is, how can you survive? Such assimilation into Caucasian culture is a risk factor that makes inner peace itself almost impossible, if not impossible. It makes survival and generational advancement almost impossible. So let's talk about assimilation. This acceptance of Caucasian socio-political claims and mindset. What claims are we talking about that now have been taken up by Africans? So when it comes to racism, the assimilated African now believes in Caucasian genetic supremacy, sometimes more than Caucasians believe it themselves. Sexism. The assimilated African believes that males are genetically superior to females. What nonsense. Any doctor can tell you that's not true. Imperialism. The assimilated African now believes that Caucasians are destined by God to rule the world. Hegemony. The assimilated African now believes that Caucasians have the God-given right to impose their culture and religion upon non-Caucasians who don't want either one. Wow. Violence. The assimilated Africans now believe that they should love Caucasians despite their hateful, violent behavior. As I said before, I don't advocate violence. But this notion that you should love the people who are so hateful toward you, who are violent towards you, and then verbally you go out proclaiming that you're going to love them anyway. Do you know that's not natural? And it means that you are turning your anger against yourself and your own people, instead of turning it toward the ones who are harming you. Here is another problem among the assimilated Africans. The development of self-hatred. How in the world can you survive, have inner peace, and advance in this world, hating yourself and loving your enemy? Acceptance of the Caucasian socio-political mindset. We're going back there again. And I will keep going down this list of 5 features of Caucasian culture in order to drill the understanding into those assimilated Africans, that you're going down a path of self-destruction. So again, we look at racism. and take it a step farther. Assimilated Africans believe in Caucasian genetic superiority, and on top of that, they also believe in African genetic inferiority. Sexism. The assimilated Africans believe that males are superior to females, and on top of that, further believe that African women should accept this claim. And I sometimes think that African men want the same thing that Caucasian men want. They want women, especially African women, to be their prostitutes and their slaves. But that's just me. Let's go on. Imperialism. Assimilated Africans now believe that Caucasians are destined by God to rule the world, and on top of that, they believe that Africans are destined by God to be servants forever, to forever be drawers of water and hewers of wood. Hegemony. Assimilated Africans believe that Caucasians have the God-given right to impose their culture and religion upon others, and on top of that, they believe that Africans should thus view slavery and colonization as blessings. You will hear it coming from Black preachers in Black churches. What kind of blasphemy is that? To say that God validates and blesses inhumanity and evil and wickedness. It is a blasphemous idea. And when it comes from anyone's mouth, that person is committing blasphemy against God. And one day, you will pay for it. Violence. The assimilated Africans believe in violence against other Africans rather than against violent Caucasians. That kind of willful, intentional violence, the kind of violent behavior that removes you from being categorized as a human being, so that now you just become an animal that enjoys killing. You cannot create a human being. What makes you think that you have the right to just kill human beings at will? It is evil. And the laws of God and the universe and karma are coming for you. Just wait for it. Now, we come to the loss of self-identity. And I have listed several indicators. You can see them on the screen. But I have something to say about that. The loss of self-identity is the most grievous. It's the greatest loss. preference to identify as anything other than African if you are of African descent. It is tantamount to reducing oneself to the quality of a speck of dust. Dust has no power of self-direction. It can be blown in any direction by the slightest puff of wind. Dust has no human will. Dust has no divine destiny. Dust has no roots. Dust is worse off than seed, because at least seed has a living essence that is capable of developing roots once it touches soil. It develops roots for stability and growth. Seed remembers who and what it is, and in its growth process, seed produces a plant in the form and essence that replicates its ancestral past. In this regard, seeds have more common sense than some human beings. So for a Black person to reject Africa, the continent that gave her or him life, to reject one's African ancestors, is to self-reduce to a speck of dust that deserves no human recognition. I'm going to repeat that. If a Black person rejects Africa and African ancestors, it means that person has self-reduced, herself or himself, to a speck of dust that deserves no human recognition, period. So, if you want to assimilate, if you are proud of your assimilated condition, that's on you. But don't feel bad when people don't respect you, even as a human being. You have become a dust person. Let me summarize. African self-hatred is a psychological impediment, and it hinders survival and advancement and puts individuals at extreme risk. The more you assimilate, the more you are fighting a war on two fronts. You're fighting an emotional war that's waged from inside yourself. You can't even sleep well at night. Even your dreams are haunting you. You're also fighting a physical war that's being waged from an outside hostile environment. Far too much time and energy are expended fighting on two fronts. How can you survive? Your culture is gone. It's gone. Your attachment to the continent is gone. Your attachment to your own ancestors, gone. how can you survive? How can you advance? You're in a terrible condition. Let me conclude. The above discussion and charts and illustrations, they reveal the stark differences between African and Caucasian cultures. It shows how the more Africans assimilate into Caucasian culture, the greater the brainwashing, so that cognitive dissonance takes place. Assimilation results in accepting an illusion, a false reality of the world, and what's most important, a hateful view of yourself, the more you assimilate into it. Assimilation, it develops a self-hatred that results in an internal hostility against yourself. And that internal hostility is often greater than the external racist social hostility. As a result, survival and advancement are very doubtful. At the very end, I have included one last illustration, and it's entitled The Process of Socio-Political System Change. And this will be the beginning of part 3, where we begin to discuss social change. We are right in the midst of that as we speak. So this particular illustration is presented here to give you time to preview the information, and this information will appear in part 3. Part 3 is the last edition of this tutorial. And part 3 provides understanding as to how a change in attitudes, beliefs, and values is the motivating force behind the current social uprisings. So part 3, my family, part 3 is critical to understanding the current uprising in America and why African Americans have to fight the same battles against racism, the same battles against discrimination, the same battles against violence, the same battles against police brutality every few years. There are uprisings, things change, but then they change back again. So we are like someone in the battered wife syndrome, where the husband beats the bejesus out of his wife, and she decides she can't take it anymore. And she goes through the motion of leaving, of making some drastic move. And he goes out and he buys flowers and brings them. He buys chocolates and he brings them. And they go through a honeymoon phase. until things calm down and the new calmed down reality becomes the norm for a little while. But then there is a relapse. Now I have drilled down on those 5 features of Caucasian culture: racism, sexism, imperialism, hegemony, and violence. Those 5 features are baked into the cake of Caucasian culture, baked into the cake of the Caucasian psyche. Some more than others. Some act a little more human than others. But all are complicit. How can I say that? That's a harsh statement. I can say that because you can be an active enabler, or you can be a passive enabler. In a court of law in Western culture, silence means consent. So every now and then, something will pinch a critical mass of Caucasian Americans, and they will agree to social change. And the change will circle around to government agencies, and they will create legislative change, and they will send those changes on to the institutions whose job it is to send out regulations that enforce these changes. And they will become the norm for a little while. And then there will be a relapse. That is what will be discussed in part 3. We are at a very critical juncture, not just in American history, in world history, in world affairs. We are at a tipping point. Well, we look forward to part 3. Thanks for tuning in, fam. Please press that like, subscribe, and share button. All 3 of them. So I leave you now with the words and the wisdom of Imhotep. Family, first, know yourself. We know everyone else except ourselves. We study everyone else except ourselves. We talk about everyone else except ourselves in terms of contributions and whatnot. So please, family, know yourself, and that will be the open door to knowledge of Almighty God and the universe. They will be made available to you. God bless you. Until next time. Bye-bye.